Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina, and I want to cover the German occupation of Italy during World War II. A lot of you viewers might ask, why would I want to cover the German occupation of Italy during World War II? Well, it means a lot to me. I am of Sicilian descent. I've covered Italy for a long time. Often Italy is one of the countries that is most covered during World War II alongside Poland and Denmark when it comes to German occupations. I want to talk about Italy because it is one of the more often covered of World War II. I want to go with a brief introduction about what was going on during World War II. Italy was on the side of Nazi Germany. They were governed by El Duce Benito Mussolini, who ruled Italy from 1922 to 1945. Italy, prior to World War II, they were a police state, the black shirts. The economy, however, was not a strong war economy. The tanks were not up to date. They were using weapons that were from World War I. There was no aircraft carriers. They were using horses. How the movement for Italy started was in World War I. Italy sided with the Allies, but was disillusioned by the peace treaty, which was the Treaty of Versailles. So in 1942, there was the March of Rome. Mussolini was appointed prime minister by King Victor Emmanuel III, who was a king from 1900 to 1946. There were small land ambitions. And there were also some incidences with Italy as well. In Greece, the Corfu incident in 1923, when Italy invaded Corfu in Greece. It led to a very small war, which was settled, and ultimately Italy was able to maintain Corfu, but Greece would eventually get that back. Mussolini long believed in demographics, so he believed in a natural alliance with Nazi Germany, despite the dislike of the Italian public, which many of them viewed the Germans with contempt. One of the generals viewed it as, our enemy is the German. So there was a very intense dislike from the Italian public towards allying with the Germans, preferring that they ally with the British and the French. The British, who were very strong naval power, also controlled the Mediterranean. And as I made mention with the economy, the British blockade forced Italy to not be a very strong war economy, so it caused Italy to ally with Germany. The Pact of Steel in 1936, the Rome-Berlin Axis, or the Pact of Steel was signed in May of 1939 between Hitler and Mussolini, but prior to that there was the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. At that point, Italy was very much concerned about Germany. The move into Austria strongly concerned Mussolini. Mussolini was seen as a counterweight to Hitler, but when Hitler and Mussolini started allying, Hitler sympathized with Mussolini when Mussolini invaded Libya and Ethiopia. Mussolini had imperial goals of a new Roman Empire from the Mediterranean Sea. There was also the Italian-Ethiopian War from October 1935 to February of 1937. Mussolini also openly, along with Hitler, aided Francisco Franco in the Spanish nationalists in the Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. And so slowly but surely, Mussolini was beginning to ally with Hitler, and they had common goals. Mussolini, as I made mention, wanted a goal of a new Roman Empire, which he wanted control from the British and the French. Both countries he saw as weak. And he felt that the power rested in Germany and that Italy could be a strong partner with Germany as Germany sought to control ultimately Europe and eventually the rest of for Europe and then the Soviet Union and then further and beyond. Mussolini wanted Africa. So he had territory in Libya, in Ethiopia, also in Italian East Africa. He called Libya and Ethiopia Italian North Africa. Now, when World War II began in 1939, Italy originally didn't join in the beginning. Italy wanted to stay neutral. There was not a lot of popular support, but on June 10th, 1940, following the invasion of France, Italy enters World War II. Again, not a lot of popular support. The majority of the Italian public did not want to go to war. So, and Mussolini said to Marshal Bagago his reasonings for entering the war was that he only needed a few thousand English and French dead to sit at the peace conference. And it actually angered Hitler, who did not want any help. He felt that the Germans were capable of handling the French and the British on their own. He did not want help from anybody. And that caused an intense frustration and anger with Hitler, who felt that Italy was only coming in after France was defeated. And as a result, the Italians only occupied small territory near the French-Italian border. Now, in 1940, Italy and Britain immediately went to war in North Africa, where you see the economic impacts. There was the British weapons were up to date. The Italian weapons were not. They were using tanks that were not up to date, horses, weapons that were from World War I. The British weapons, however, were up to date. And the Italians' goal, Mussolini's goal, was to invade Egypt and to reach the Suez Canal to create an entrance into the Middle East. Now, there was 36,000 British troops against 236,000 Italian troops. And the British would ultimately manhandle the Italians in North Africa. There was 2 battles of El Alamein. The first one went from the 1st through the 27th of July, 1942. The second one was from October 23rd, 1942 to November 11th, 1942. Both times they were won by the British. Mussolini wanted to also invade Greece and was beaten badly. I mean, it caused the Germans to intervene. The Germans had plans to invade the Soviet Union. The Greeks were beating Mussolini badly. The Germans were also having problems in Yugoslavia. So the Germans were again now forced to intervene in the issues that the Italians were having in Greece, Yugoslavia, North Africa, and France. But now, instead of being that partner that Italy was being with Germany, Mussolini was reduced now to a junior partner, with Hitler being the main, with it being hierarchical, with Germany on top and Italy ultimately now the junior partner. And we weren't talking about Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So this further caused resentment amongst the Italians toward the Germans. But Hitler also viewed the Italians with contempt as well. Italy had a mild approach. They would indirectly protect the Jews in their territory, not making Germany very happy. Also, Germany would not be happy that Italy would not surrender their Jews to Germany. The Italians viewed the Jews as a humanitarian measure. There were some massacres, however. The Dominican massacre, located in Greece on February 16th through the 17th of 1943. But, excuse me, the Italians would not surrender their Jews, or any of the Jews who were living in Italian-occupied territory, to the Germans, and they did that mostly out of humanitarian grounds. The Italian soldiers saw what the Germans were doing, and did not want to ultimately associate themselves with that. Now, as I made mention, there was growing discontent from the Italian public. Majority wanted out of the war. There was a lot of anger at Mussolini, at Hitler, and at the war. And in 1943, July 10th, the Americans and the British invaded Sicily. So as a result, on July 25th, the Grand Council, which was the fascist Grand Council, they limited Mussolini's power. They appealed to King Victor Emmanuel III, to dismiss Mussolini as the prime minister. And ultimately, Mussolini would be arrested and sent to prison. Then on September 3rd, the British would cross into Italy, and the General Marshal Bagagli signed the armistice with the British and the Americans, officially ending, and then it wouldn't be announced until 5 days later that the Italians were leaving the war. There was massive celebrations out in the streets. The Germans, however, would be forced to increase their divisions from 2 divisions to 7. They ended up taking over vital infrastructure, and they would disarm Italian troops. And that began the German occupation of Italy, which ultimately began from September 8th, 1943 to May 2nd, 1945. Germany would launch Operation Axis, which was also called Operation Apache. They disarmed Italian troops. They took over control of vital infrastructure, mostly roads, communications. They also would take over Italian-occupied territory in France, in Greece, and in Yugoslavia. So, as a result, the Germans gave their now former Italian allies a choice. They gave them 3 choices. They gave them choice to fight alongside the Germans. They could also become slave laborers or be sent to concentration camps in Germany. Now, most Italian prisoners would ultimately choose the option of becoming slave laborers. There were, however, Italian troops who did resist the Germans. The Cephalonia massacre, which was on a Greek island, there was 5,155 Italian soldiers were massacred by the Germans. Then there were other Italian prisoners that were put in boats, and the Germans intentionally, purposely sunk those ships. An additional, but also what also did not help was the Allies, the United States and Great Britain. They raided on 3 ships, and an additional 3,000 Italian prisoners drowned. And the remaining survivors were sent to concentration camps. There was also the Greek island of Corfu, I made mention earlier. 8,000 Italian soldiers were there. They were massacred. 280 soldier officers were executed. The others were sent as slave laborers or sent to concentration camps. Then the Battle of Kos, 91 Italian soldiers were killed, and it drove Italians to resent and fight, but it also to resent and fight. But it also, there were some some Italians who were allied with the Germans. So it ended up becoming an indirect Italian civil war, which was, there was Allied-supported Italian Army, Navy, and Air Force versus the RSI, which was the Italian Socialist Republic, which was controlled by Mussolini, who now at this point, the Germans, led by Otto Sarkozy, found Mussolini in his prison cell and rescued him from his cell, and they flew him to northern Italy, where Mussolini would meet with Hitler. At this point, Mussolini was not the strong man that he used to be. He, at this point, was very frail. He was beaten down, broken, kind of a broken old man. And he was not very popular in Italy. He was very much considered a German puppet. And so there was a lot of Italians that were not happy with Mussolini or what was going on in the war. So there were several resistance movements in Italy. The first, one of the more noticeable ones, was the siege of Naples, which was from September 27th through September 30th of 1943. This book here by Donna Jo Napoli, Fire in the Hills. If you guys have read Stones and Water, this is the first book that focuses on an Italian boy from 1941 to 1943. The second one is actually a continuation of it. The Fire in the Hills, the road to home, basically. This goes deep into the liberation, the siege of Naples, in which Roberto, the main character, was allied with, or was a German translator. He was forced into translating for the Germans, and he ended up having to watch millions of massacres take place, and was forced to serve the Germans. So the siege began on September 8th, which was actually clashes between Naples residents, Neapolitans, and the Germans. So there were a lot of clashes that were taking place following the Germans' occupation of Italy and ultimately the Italian surrender. And many Italian troops fled their posts as a result of the surrender, not knowing what to do. So the Germans occupied Naples. On September 22nd, the Germans, led by Colonel Scholz, issued a decree of forced labor for all men who were aged 18 to 33 years old. And a lot of these deportations were forced. The Germans would go into the houses, they would take the men, mostly at gunpoint, they'd force them out in the streets, and they would forcibly force them into like warehouses and things like that, and force them to serve the German army. There was citizens of Naples rose up in anger. There was massive protest. There was some fighting. There was just a lot of rebellion, a lot of mutiny. So as a result, Colonel Scholz orders that 5 Italians would be killed for every one, or orders 5 decrees. He orders that 100 Italians would be killed for 1 German soldier dead. There was a curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. There was to be calm throughout the siege. No weapons would be allowed. And there was supposed to be a calm. However, many Napoleons rebelled. They went into gun factories. They would take guns. They would take the weapons. They would storm German areas that most Germans would hang out at. They would attack police headquarters. They would attack hotels. At this point, the Germans had control of the police and the hotel areas. And on October 1st, the Germans would retreat from Naples while the Allies would come in on October 1st. However, the people of Naples are given the credit because they were the ones that ultimately drove the Germans out of Naples. And you'll see this throughout the war, that it wasn't the Allies who didn't exactly drive the Germans out. It was these partisan groups, these Italian groups of Italian civilians, Italian military, and several groups, like the partisans. I would definitely recommend a couple of very, very good movies as well, other than the Joe Napoli movies. Cher has a good movie out that I would definitely recommend that viewers watch. It focuses on the peace movement in Italy that ultimately would fight against the Germans. It's a great movie. Many Italians went into the mountains and fought against the RSI and the Nazis, many of which were focused on guerrilla warfare. Wanted to surprise the Germans, wanted to trick the Germans, fool them. And many, as I said, formed partisan groups. By 1944, by May of 1944, there was about 70,000 to 80,000 Italian partisans by May of 1944. And this would grow. In August of 1944, 100,000 men and women formed and joined the partisans. And then ultimately by May of 1945, by the end of the war, it grew to 250,000. So there was growing resentment, growing fighting against both the Nazis, but also the the fascists who supported Mussolini, the RSI. Now, throughout the war, there was 50,000 partisans who were killed, and the Germans would be forced to fight in the mountains, and it was just brutal and bloody. Fighting was mostly in the countryside. There was mostly in the mountains and the Alps. It impacted the war because the Germans had to focus on fighting the Italian partisans. One of the big comparisons you could compare it to was the Spanish, when the Spanish fought the French in 1808 during the Napoleonic Wars. The French were focused on fighting. Obviously, they had to fight the British, but they were also fighting the Spanish and Portuguese partisans. And it took its toll on the French, where many French soldiers were killed. It was the same thing for the Germans in Italy. It impacted the war because the Germans were also fighting the Americans and the British, but they were also fighting these Italian partisans, and these Italian partisans were taking its toll on the Germans. Up to 30,000 to 35,000 Germans were killed as a result of the partisan fighting in Italy. There was also major uprisings, especially in northern Italy. There was a lot of discontent against the RSI. People were not happy about the war. They wanted out of the war. They were sick of Hitler. They were sick of the Nazis. They were sick of the Germans. And they were also sick of Mussolini. They wanted Mussolini out. In 1944, there was the Ardente massacre, in which 335 Italian civilians and Jews were massacred by the Nazis and their RSI allies. Another massacre happened in August of 1944, St. Anna's di Sesma massacre, where 560 were killed. 130 of them were children. And it only further intensified as the Germans would continue fighting. They disregarded who was a civilian, who was a partisan. They didn't care who it was. So you saw a lot of indiscriminate killings as well, especially from the Germans. There was a Holocaust in Italy. This book right here, this Holocaust book by Deborah DeWark and Robert Jan van Pelt. This goes into a little bit of depth about the Holocaust in not just in Italy, but everywhere through Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. But this covers with Italy. I thought that this book covered it really, really well. Karl Wolff was the SS commander in Italy. Also, you had Theodor Danker in 1943. And then you had another guy whose name was Bob Heinier, who worked with Adolf Eichmann in 1944. There was a Congress of Verona, which basically ordered Italian police to arrest Jews. However, there was an exception, and this caused, as I said, this caused a lot of resentment amongst Germans because the Jews were respected on humanitarian grounds. So the Germans were not happy that even during the occupation of Italy, that they basically ordered the Italian police to arrest Jews, but there was a catch. Jews could not be 70 years old or older, and they were not allowed to be arrested if they had a mixed marriage. So that caused a lot of resentment amongst Germans, amongst the Nazis, towards their Italian allies. There was two phases of the Holocaust in Italy. There was the first one came from September of 1943 to January of 1944, which primarily happened in the cities. Then the second one occurred in early of 1944, which was much more centralized. It was much more centralized it went more towards into the countryside. You saw the Nazis were going everywhere, finding Jews, arresting them, sending them up north to Poland. About 8,000 Italian Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Many of them were sent to northern Italy or to Poland, especially to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. About 8,000 Jews, Italian Jews, were killed in the Holocaust. There were also several prison camps in northern Italy where Jews, political opponents, many people were sent to these prison camps in northern Italy where they were treated under very, very harsh conditions. No food for a time, there was no water. Some of them were not supported under the Geneva Convention, even though Italians were supposed to be treated under the Geneva Convention. Also, $1 billion in property, in belongings, gold, jewelry, $1 billion in property were also looted as a result of the Holocaust in Italy. A lot of times, people assume the Holocaust happened in Poland. It didn't just happen in Poland. It happened in Italy. It happened in Hungary. It happened in Romania. It happened in Bulgaria. It's just Italy. It was just covered in Italy because I'm just covering the one in Italy because it impacted a lot of Italians, and the Italians were, quote, allies with the Germans, but ultimately, as the one general said, the enemy was the German. Now, in April of 1945, the Allies, with the help of the Italian partisans, finally liberated all of Italy in April of 1945. Mussolini was finally captured and executed on April 27, 1945. The Germans would ultimately surrender on May 2nd, 1945, ending the German occupation of Italy. In 1946, King Victor Emmanuel III resigns or abdicates. His son, Umberto II, takes the throne in Italy, but it will only be brief. Later that year, the monarchy was abolished, and through a constitutional referendum, Italy becomes a republic. In February 10th of 1947, there was the Treaty of Peace amongst the Allies and Italy. Now, the impacts of the war today are still there in Italy. You have your left groups, you have your right groups. Excuse me. Many of the groups in the right still view Mussolini very, very positively for what he did in terms of an economic front and what he was able to do. But there's still a lot of resentment towards why Italy would side with Germany in World War II, why Italy was even involved in the war in the first place. And Italy didn't have to be part of that war, but Mussolini made a fateful choice in 1940 to ultimately side with Hitler, wanting to have more land because of his dream of a Roman Empire. That's something that historians should never forget when looking at Italy and their role during World War II. Mussolini's decision ultimately led to Italy being occupied, and ultimately Italy becoming, in a way, a loser of the war. But also Italy would fight alongside the Allies, and ultimately it still exists today. So in many ways, Italy benefited from allying with the West in the Cold War, and they were able to get their economics back in order, and Italy was able to prosper. Tourism is a major thing in Italy, and the tourism industry really, really helped. Also, the United States and Britain also helped out. And today, Italy still has a king. They don't have a king anymore. They still have parliament. They're a republic at present. Well, that'll do it for this episode of History Now. Have a great night, Lake Orion. Take care.